But let me start with something you haven't heard about today. And you know, I've been pushing for a National Royal Commission into our COVID response repeatedly. It's a no-brainer, right? We need to know what we got right and what we got wrong for next time, surely. Anthony Albanese even promised an inquiry before the election, but he's done nothing about it since. Most politicians and journalists are running dead on this issue, presumably because they know that their complicity in the fear campaigns and the overreaction can only be exposed by any inquiry. This is not a problem confined just to this country, though. Other countries, as you know, also had governments that overreacted and a media that cheered them on. And they too have had trouble getting proper inquiries underway. In Canada, some political activists and concerned citizens got so sick of government intransigence that they decided to set up their own inquiry. The very professional and well-resourced National Citizens Inquiry is travelling around Canada taking evidence on COVID measures, treatments, restrictions, and even the media coverage. Yet the media coverage. I don't need to remind you about how the ABC in particular, but most media in Australia, really hyped up the fear during the pandemic. Norman Swan on the ABC was a repeat offender.
The predictions at the moment, if this hockey stick doesn't change that much, is that we'll be out of ICU beds in New South Wales. Victoria will be behind that by April 10th. And in that case, ICU physicians will be faced with some very difficult decisions.
Just so alarmist, just so wrong that he was off the charts. Swan kept talking up the threat. He exaggerated the likely outcomes. He promoted lockdowns and rings of steel and all the rest of it, and he was wrong time and time again. And at the ABC, they also dismissed out of hand early reports about the origins of the virus.
Well, I've looked into this, and other journalists have looked into this as well as scientists, and there really is very little evidence. It's on the outer bounds of possibility, but really so unlikely that you could say definitely that it's not the case. It's not from the lab.
Yep, it was not from the lab, according to the ABC very early on. They're very certain of themselves, weren't they? Well, in the Canadian Citizens Inquiry, a former journalist from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that's their version of the ABC, this former journalist, Rodney Palmer, has forensically picked apart the CBC's COVID reporting on a range of crucial pandemic issues. For instance, look at this early report telling people how to rebut so-called conspiracy theories about the Wuhan lab claims.
As a loved one, let's say it's your dad, drops into the family group chat with something he thinks is real. It's something about China manufacturing the coronavirus. There's a link to a site you've never heard of with a message calling it scary stuff. So what do you do with this? Do you ignore it? Do you call them out saying how ridiculous you think this is? Maybe send an article from a legitimate source quoting credible scientists on why the virus wasn't manufactured. Conspiracies can be just as infectious, just as dangerous as a virus.
Yeah, those legitimate media sources that got so many things wrong. The CBC sounding just like the ABC there, weren't they? So have a listen to Palmer's reaction to that piece.
And I thought, well, wait a minute. How do you know it wasn't manufactured in a lab in China? What evidence does the CBC have 20 days into this or 15 days into this that this was not manufactured in a lab? There was an assumption that she put forth instantly.
Exactly. It wasn't about evidence, it was about the line, the narrative. And usually the information or arguments that were run came from governments or from the World Health Organization. So rather than facts or news gathering, we saw an awful lot of propaganda. Palmer summarises the CBC coverage in a way that must sound very familiar to those of us who've been paying attention in this country.
Between March 2020 and the present, CBC is suppressing critics of government policy on COVID-19 response. They are misleading Canadians that COVID-19 vaccines are 100% safe. They are falsely broadcasting that ivermectin is deadly to humans when in fact it is a life-saving medicine and has been proven so in their own stories for COVID-19. And they're promoting an identifiable group that they call anti-vaxxers, fomenting fear and hatred against them in order to get more of these deeply flawed vaccines into the bodies of more Canadians. None of this is news gathering.
Yep, you don't have to agree with everything he says to know that he's right on this. It wasn't news gathering, it was spin. It was propaganda. That's what went on, and it's still going on. How many in the media in this country, for instance, are calling out our ongoing vaccine mandates? How many in the media in this country have reported on the federal government's COVID online censorship? That too is still happening. How many have engaged in any scrutiny about whether lockdowns, border closures, curfews and other restrictions did more harm than good? We need a royal commission, unless there's someone out there who could fund an Australian citizens' inquiry.